All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started since it's 11:02 by my clock. I'm Jan Joannides, and I am the Executive Director of Renewing the Countryside, a nonprofit based in Minnesota that works on a variety of issues, including farmland access. And we are a partner in a multi-state network of the Farmland Access Hub. And we're here as part of that. And we're very excited today to have Kathy Ruhf with us. We have worked with Kathy now for, I don't know, maybe 7 years, 6 or 7 years, since the inception of the Farmland Access Hub. And she is a national expert on these issues. She came and spoke at the Farmland Summit that we had this past fall. She is a senior advisor at Land for Good, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about herself. I did want to just repeat again in the chat, if you want to put your name and your state or town and state. Also, we're going to do Q&A at the very end. So we're going to mute everyone just because we're expecting, well, we had a lot of people sign up. We have, what, 67 on now, but we had over, I think, 180 people sign up. So by muting everyone, we'll just be sure that we don't have background noises, because we are going to be recording this, and we do have people who aren't able to join today who wanted to get a copy of the recording. So Kathy will do her presentation. We will then do a Q&A session, and Bonnie on our staff, Bonnie Warndall, is going to be moderating that. Kara Komodo is helping, and Brett Olson are helping with the technical issues on the back. And I'm very glad to say that I just remembered at the very last minute to check and see if we had put on the larger than 100 meeting people in the meeting. And I hadn't, so I had to just sign up to that. So if we do get over 100 people, will not be prevented from coming. So with that, I guess one more thing is that we do have a short survey. I think it's 7 questions that should take you like 2 to 4 minutes. We're going to put that in the chat at the end of Kathy's presentation, and then at the end of the Q&A, and it'll also show up in your browser when you leave the meeting. So if you could please take that, that really helps us to figure out how to kind of better improve the work that we're doing and to learn what people are interested in. And a little bit about who you are, whether you're a farmer or a technical assistance provider or those sorts of things. Okay, so I think with that, we can turn it over to Kathy.
Okay, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I am Kathy Ruhf. I'm based in Western Massachusetts. I work with Land for Good, which is a nonprofit. We work our direct services in the 6 New England states, and we also do training and advocacy work nationally. So I have a PowerPoint slide deck that we can turn to right now. That hookup, I want to say how much I appreciate your interest in being here. And for some of you, some of this material may be familiar. For others of you, it might be brand new. I'm going to do a little bit of a big picture context, some historical, some high altitude. I'm going to do a little bit on sort of practical ways that you can participate and think about your role in this topic area. Renewing the Countryside had asked me for the presentation that I did at the Farmland Summit to include something about some non-traditional approaches. So it will be a lot of material. If it is new to you, just let it wash over you. There's no expectation that you retain all of this. It's a huge topic. I've been doing this work for a lot of years, and I'm still learning every day. All right, next slide. So again, this presentation was basically given last November. It was Midwest oriented. I've changed a few slides, but basically it is the same. Next. So let's start with why are we here, at least virtually together? Issues around agricultural land tenure are not new. This quote is one of my favorites. It's from Liberty Hyde Bailey, known as the father of American horticulture, over 100 years ago. The equitable partition of land is the necessary basis of all self-sustaining agriculture, and that varying forms of land partition have arisen with the evolution of society. Next. So several years later, another quote from an extension educator out of Illinois, noting that how farmland is acquired, held, and operated has always been a matter of national interest, for the just and fair conditions of tenure are recognized as essential to our national welfare. Not so long ago, I was involved in a national project called Farmlasts, where we concluded, based on our research, that there is currently no overarching US policy regarding agricultural land tenure. So the work that we are all doing or interested in pursuing is really breaking new ground and has been doing so for a while. Next slide. So why are we here? The future of US agriculture depends on the ability of new generations to establish farms and ranches. Those of you working with new farmers will understand that that is absolutely the bedrock for this kind of pursuit. But it's also true that agricultural land access and transfer are not new issues, but today's challenges are especially critical and complex. For example, concerns about equity, land stewardship, and land justice deepen our work. So today, what are the just and fair conditions that we are concerned about? Next. Why am I here? Well, many years ago, in 1987, I started working at the New England Small Farm Institute, which is a private nonprofit in Massachusetts that was developing a lease on publicly owned land in order to turn around and sublease to beginning farmers. In that capacity, I developed a second program, FarmLink program in the nation way back in 1994. After my stint at the New England Small Farm Institute, I joined or started Land for Good. That was 20 years ago now. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary. Initially, it was to assist farmers with succession planning because I understood it at NESFI that that was a huge gap. Now our audiences include farm seekers, landowners, that's non-farming landowners, and retiring farmers, in a combination of direct service, advocacy, research, education, professional training, innovation, and network building. We do most of our direct service nationally, in New England, and we also work nationally. All right, let's look at some facts. Farm ownership and land wealth are increasingly concentrated into fewer and older farming and also non-farming landowners. In fact, 90% of agricultural land wealth is owned by white people. Entry and exit are flip sides of the same coin, and this is a quote from the Farmland Research Project. If older farmers can't easily exit, their land cannot become available to entering farmers. That seems obvious, but we often lament the disconnect between farmers leaving and farmers entering. Furthermore, it's important to note that nearly 90% of farm landlords are not farmers, and that's from the total study by USDA in 2014. Next. More facts. I thought this was interesting. Until the early 2000s, young farmers actually rented all or most of their land. This focus on farmland ownership, which is completely legitimate, is a rather new shift in emphasis. And it may be that federal programs, including attractive loan programs to beginning farmers toward ownership, may be encouraging that shift. On the other hand, ERS at USDA has also determined that beginning farmers without land debt are in fact more likely to succeed in the long run. We know that farmers of color and other marginalized groups face particular structural systemic obstacles to their land access opportunities. Also, research has shown that only 25% of farmland is expected to be sold to non-family. So a lot of land is being kept in the family, and of that, over a third is being placed in a trust, which to me means that the questions about the disposition of that land and who it goes to next is in fact being kicked down the road. Next. So what are we asking when we are investigating farmland access and tenure? We want to know and think about how agricultural land is held and by whom. We want to understand how farms and farmland can successfully transfer and have a grasp on what we mean by success. We want to know the ways in which traditional assumptions and models and methods are no longer adequate given the current landscape of land tenure. And we also want to know what roles each of us plays in advancing equitable land access, tenure, and transfer, whether or not you are directly involved in land access or with beginning farmers or with farm succession. Everyone in the service community in farming and food systems has a role to play. So that begs the question, what is our goal collectively? What is your goal individually in your professional capacity and your organization's goal? And how do you and we collectively define success? Next. So I'm a systems thinker, and I think this little graphic helps us to understand that there are at play and intersecting the trajectory of farm seekers, those wanting to get onto land, and also those who are on land but looking to adjust their land tenure situation. So for example, they may want to go from renting to owning. They may want to problem solve some situation in their lease. Then we have landowners, both farming and non-farming landowners. We have service providers, and we have the role of communities and policymakers. All of these elements come into play when we're talking about the system of farmland access, tenure, and transfer. Next. So it is important to me in the way that I think, and encourage you also, to think in terms of our own views and values. For one, about land ownership. And these questions are coming up in new ways in the last, I would say, decade or so. Whether we see land as a commodity, as private property, which it is, and how we feel about that. Land as wealth and power. Some people see land as a working asset. Some people see land as their identity, as their family legacy. Now, these are not mutually exclusive, but some of them, in fact, are. Then there's the whole question of land's conservation. For what purpose? Does it have to be actively farmed for it to be successfully conserved? In what ways would it be farmed? And then who is it accessible to? Next slide. So the questions I raise are about you and your audience's values about land as property, land as equity, equitable access to land, security, and legacy. And these are all questions that we have to grapple with in particular social, historical, and political contexts. You remember Liberty Hyde Bailey talking about the allocation of interests in property, and that has to do with control, power, asset building, and so on. We also want to understand the care of the land in terms of what rights does the land have to stewardship and protection in relationship to land access and tenure. We not understand land in our current cultural context is private property. Are there alternatives or ways to reconceive of land by asking those questions? And furthermore, we think increasingly now about land as stolen property. What are the remedies using that framework? Next slide, please. So I'm also a student of social change, and I include this slide on the 3 social change orientations, just to pique your interest in thinking about how you and your organization might fit and the programs that you are developing. In the inclusion social change orientation, our main goal is to increase participation. It's a service orientation. In the reform orientation, we want to change the conditions, the current conditions. We want to improve them. We want to build networks and improve policies. The transformation social change orientation is a radical change of foundational principles and assumptions. The classic example in our universe is questioning land as private property. Next slide. Furthermore, your organization may have an orientation that either encourages or somewhat limits your ability to act on your social orientation. Is it mainly service in terms of building your capacity of your customers to achieve their land access or transfer objectives? Is it a social change orientation? In other words, to improve the conditions for your customers to achieve their land objectives. Your organization can have both orientations. At times, they may be incompatible. Next. All right, now we're going to get into a few topics more particularly, and the first one is access to land. So what are these land access challenges? We could spend all day, or in fact, several days, talking about what they are. In short bullet form, we know that they are about land values, the escalating value of agricultural land, and the competition for them, and at what scale. I think scale is important and sort of under-acknowledged in the land access and tenure and transfer arena. Small farms have different challenges in terms of access and transfer than mid-sized farms, and mid-sized farms have different access and transfer challenges than large-scale farms. More farmers are coming from non-farm backgrounds, which means they're not likely to inherit land. It also means that they have different kinds of networks to access or maybe not be able to access. Increasingly, farmers are aging, and by and large, they are not adequately prepared to transfer their land. Furthermore, and I touched on this earlier, we have a culture and myths around farm ownership, that you're not really a farmer unless you own your own land. In fact, 40% of US farmland is rented, and about that same amount of farmers rent some or all of the land that they farm. Whether you're serving farm seekers or exiting farmers or non-farming landowners, the services and policies are inadequate. There aren't, I've heard this in every region of the US, there aren't enough attorneys, there aren't enough financial advisors, there are not enough land access support services, and so on. In addition to the land piece, we have to remember that people have to live somewhere where they're farming, and so affordable farmer and labor housing is an attached issue as well. And then, more recently, the impacts of climate change. What does that mean for how people farm, where they want to farm? We're getting more and more inquiries from people from other regions to come and farm in the Northeast because we have more adequate, ample water, at least for now, and so on. Next slide, please. Excuse me while I take a sip. All right, what are the considerations? This is sort of Land for Good's laundry list in bright color, and we're going to unpack these as in the next several slides. The land has to be available. It has to be accessible in a practical sense. It has to be appropriate. It has to be affordable, secure, equitable, and findable. So we're going to talk a little bit about these. Thank you. So making land available, that means both land that is active in agriculture now and the question of potential new agriculture, new land. In New England, there's a lot of discussion about whether forests should be cleared to make more room for land so that we become more regionally food secure. On the other hand, there are strong arguments to keep land in forest. That's as an example. So in terms of available and findable, who are landowners? Here at Land for Good, we've made a concerted effort to prioritize non-farming landowners because we know that we need to get more landowners engaged in working on the issues of land access. So who are they? What are their demographics? Where are they located? What do they need? And then where can farm seekers look? This whole question of findability. And we know that there are FarmLink programs proliferating throughout the country. I just point out the distinction between a FarmLink service and a land access program. There are lots of land access programs that don't do farm linking. Land for Good is one of those. We are a partner in a farm link service. So just to, put a pin in that distinction. And of course, there are other places for farm seekers to look. Next slide. What does accessible mean? We use land access as sort of the broadest and sort of socio-political term, but it also has a practical sense. They have to be able to get onto it. If a landowner says, oh, I've got these lovely 5 acres out back, but there's no access road that will accommodate the appropriately scaled equipment, it's not really accessible. So it means able or capable of being reached or obtained. But in the broader sense, access also means the capacity that includes the rights, power, and control on access to access land. So it has as much to do with power and control as it has to do with the practicalities of getting on land. And then furthermore, what is appropriate? Appropriate for whom? Is it suited to the enterprise? Is it under reasonable and fair terms? And that also includes the quality of life. A parcel might be appropriate for a particular farm method, but if it doesn't include a residence, if it is close to a community that is attractive to the farmer, then it really may not qualify as appropriate. Next slide. So affordability is not the same as cheap. It means something that someone can afford. That seems obvious, but we tend to equate affordable with cheap. Somebody who has, significant resources, and by the way, over half of beginning farmers in our region and in other states where I've looked at the demographics are over the age of 45, beginning farmers over the age of 45. So that means they've done something else. That may mean they have more resources than a younger beginning farmer. It may not mean that they have necessary skills, but their baseline for affordability may be different. It also may mean better financing. It's more affordable if you can get a better loan or, on better terms and so on. It also may mean that there are ways to reduce the cost, like looking in more rural locations or land that has less desirable soil. Or it may mean don't purchase the land, rent it, and that may be more affordable. In fact, a colleague of mine at Farm Credit did a comparison of a financial sort of a budget for farms that were purchased under market rate, farms purchased with the development rights removed, and farms that were rented. And the net return to family living in the rented budget was about 5 times the net return to the farm that was trying to pay off purchased land. So we also need to understand that affordability is connected to financial readiness. And that means making sure that the farmers that we work with understand their personal, family, business, and acquisition finance profiles, that they are that they have a grasp on their financial realities, and that they understand what their options are in terms of paying for or renting land. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, security in a broad sense means freedom from all of those scary things. It means a sense of safety or certainty. In terms of tenure security, it means that you are not likely to have to worry about being terminated, being kicked off your land. That's what people mention most. But it also has to do with adequate control over what it is that you are renting or owning. It means that the risks are manageable, that the return on your investment is worthwhile in your calculation. And it also means there's some sense of predictability, and that your rights and your conditions of tenure are enforceable to your benefit. Next slide. Equitable. So equity means 2 things. It has to do with ways to build and redeem equity. It also means equitable in the sense of fair and unbiased. And we think a lot about equity these days in terms of the distribution of rights and responsibilities and rewards, not the same as equal. It also means being respectful and appropriate to various cultures, with particular attention to historic dispossession and current discrimination and cultural barriers. Equitable also refers to the ways to build and redeem equity And it's important to remember that it's not necessarily in the land, although for some communities and individuals, that is the key way to build equity through wealth building in land. Next slide. So tenure options, this is pretty basic. There's a fork in the road. One fork says you can own the land. The other fork says you don't own the land. In either case, what are the terms and conditions of that ownership or tenancy? In addition, there may be paths to ownership, including on a particular piece of property, and I will get into that later. And it can be some of each for an individual farmer, and it can change over time on their tenure path. It has to fit the farmer's business plan and family situation, and it also makes room for revision, that path. I will also talk a little bit about the scenario where there are multiple owners and multiple tenants. There are some tenants who have leases with a dozen or so owners, and there are some owners who have leases with a dozen or more tenants. You can see where tenancy can get pretty complicated. Next slide. So again, the path to ownership may parallel the farmer's career path. In other words, they may start by owning or purchasing, renting a very small parcel, then they may be scaling up. They may own something and then rent more land and so on. Another path to ownership is known as lease to own. Farmers are increasingly expressing interest in this concept, which is not a legal term. The two methods under lease to own are the option to purchase and the right of first refusal, which is also sort of a subset of that is the right of first offer. And we'll get into that a little bit more. Then there's a land contract, also known as an installment sale. And then a path to ownership is via the transfer of interests in an entity, such as an LLC, a limited liability company, or a corporation. And then, if you're lucky, you might get gifted land. Next slide. This is a visual, sort of a graphic representation of that allocation of rights in land that I talked about, and I won't get into it in great detail. This is a graphic from our guide to forms of land access. And you can see that it's in the form of a bundle of rights, or maybe you've heard of a bundle of sticks in land ownership. And the two columns represent the farmer and other entities. In sole ownership, the farmer owns all of those rights. There's also shared ownership, in which the farmer and other entities share the entire bundle of sticks. An easement is an example of the divided ownership of those sticks. The path to ownership is where the ownership of those interests gradually transfers over time. A leasehold interest is one stick in that bundle where the other entities still retain other rights, such as rights of ownership, mineral extraction, and so on. And then there are other arrangements which do not give the farmer an ownership, a right in the farmland, such as a license or a permit. Let's go on to the next slide, which is also a graphic, which spells out in a slightly different way those that fork in the road: ownership now, no ownership, or ownership in the future. Again, this is from our Farm Access Methods Guide. Next slide. All right, now we're going to talk about seekers and owners. Next slide. Who are seekers? On the right there, you'll see a farmer typology, which was developed at the New England Small Farm Institute many years ago. It's a little bit different way of conceptualizing the beginning farmer universe. You can see down at the bottom, the USDA definition of a beginning farmer is more simply anyone who has operated a farm for 10 years or less. It's important to unpack the beginning farmer demographic a little bit more, which is why I put that typology up there, because the prospective farmer who is not yet farming is going to have different needs and need a different service approach than those who are already established, maybe in their 7th or 8th year, and are having issues or want to change their tenure situation. So where are they on their career path? Does age matter? I referenced that before. Yes, it does. What is their asset inventory? What are they bringing to their seeking activities? What seeking stage are they at? Are they learning? Are they up to deciding? Are they actually engaged in a search? and property assessment, or do they need help actually negotiating? And then if you are engaged in this service sector, what are your tasks relative to this stage? And at Land for Good, because we do so much intensive training with our field agents who do this work, we've done a lot of thinking and sort of conceptualizing and graphic representation of these stages and the service orientation that we offer. Next slide. Seekers are a very diverse audience. There's at least a partial, sort of extensive but not exhaustive list of all the kinds of seekers based on their cultural background, their ethnicity, gender, ability, background, location, and so on. Homesteaders, I put a question mark because sometimes Farm Link and Farm Access programs do work with people who are looking for situations for subsistence and sort of backyard farming. At Land for Good, we focus on farmers with commercial intent. Next slide. So considerations for these seekers, their personal, professional, and family goals. One of the first steps is to try to tease those out with your farm seeker customer. What is their readiness? What networks and resources do they have at their disposal? How do their language, culture, and history fit into their profile as a seeker? Considering especially the experiences and needs of marginalized groups, and our constant awareness of power dynamics and differentials in the seeking process and in negotiating successful land tenure arrangements. Next slide. What do seekers need? As I mentioned, goal and value clarification, basic tenure education. Too often they come in regardless of what stage they're at and they say, oh, I need to buy some land. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Do they understand what their options are? Do they understand the implications of one method of approaching land tenure? Do they understand the bundle of sticks and so on? Are they financially ready to pursue their objectives? Do they understand about leasing versus purchasing? Do they have enough knowledge to do good searches and assessments and evaluations of properties? And then last but not least, do they have the communication, decision-making, and negotiation skills to actually complete a successful transaction? Next. All right, now we're going to talk about double rainbows and farmland owners. Farmland owners break into two main categories: active farmers and retired. These are active farmers and retiring farmers. In the farming landowner category. Active farmers may rent land from others. They may rent land to others. They also may be expanding. They may be looking for new partnerships and so on. So active farmers are among what we call the seekers, even though they are already established on land. Then, of course, the retiring farmers, and I'll get into this a little bit more. They may be transitioning their land and or their business. And it's important to put an asterisk around that because the transfer of real estate is not necessarily the same as the transfer of business. So are they selling their land? Are they consolidating into larger farms? Do we care about what happens to that land? And then, as I mentioned, the ubiquity of trusts and what that means for the disposition of land down the road. Next slide. So as distinguished from farming landowners, we also include non-farming landowners. And remember that 90% of farm landlords are not farmers. So non-operating land owners is different from non-operating landlords, which is USDA's term. It's a little bit of a hair splitter, but I think it's important to point that out because not all landowners of agricultural land are landlords. So they may be retired farmers, they may be farm inheritors, they may be other private landowners who bought an estate property or all of those scenarios that we can imagine. Also, there may be corporate and investor owners. I'll talk a teeny bit about that. Institutional landowners, religious entities, educational institutions, conservation organizations. And then there's a whole universe of public land from municipal to county, state, and federal land. And it's important just to keep this laundry list in mind because there's a lot of landowners out there that, are are ripe for working with. And we do quite a bit of work with some of these less traditional landowners as well. Next slide. What motivates landowners? Certainly, for many of them, they want to keep their land in agriculture. They want to contribute to the local food and farm economy. And that has become increasingly true the more that people understand, the notion about where their food comes from and buying local and so on. There's a new awareness that people are starting to connect the dots. They want to protect and steward their land. They may want to offer an opportunity to a new generation. They want to make sure that their land is active and occupied and not vacant. There's some, vandalism and so on that can be a concern if land is, especially because many non-farming landowners do not live on or even near their land. Some are interested in a financial return, and we need to be clear with them about what that may or how realistic that may or may not be in terms of offsetting their carrying costs. Almost every state has a preferential or current use tax program. So if their land is in active agriculture, they get sometimes a quite hefty property tax advantage. They may, in fact, want to partner in or make sure that improvements are happening on their site. They may have social justice motivations. And they may just feel akin to the aesthetic of farming on their land. Next slide, please. So some of the considerations, are they on site or absentee? There are challenges in either direction. And what do they want? What do they think they want from an arrangement? Financial, personal, and social. How familiar are they with farming? Who are the decision makers? Oftentimes there's a bunch of heirs or a bunch of cousins that can complicate the situation. What is the community context for making that land available? And then from a practical sense, what are you in your role in your organization offering for landowners? Next slide. All right, farm succession, we could spend a week on this very complicated issue. Farm succession, farm transfer, transition are often used interchangeably. Succession is the transfer of income, assets, and management from one owner or operator to another. Succession planning is just what it says, the planning for that transfer. There are many advisors, navigators, coaches, and subject experts that have to be brought to the table to complete any of these successful transfers. Next slide. So up to 90% of retiring farmers do not have an exit plan. Compared to seekers who are very motivated, there's lots of reasons, understandable reasons why do not tend to approach farm succession with any amount of enthusiasm. It's completely, it's very complex. The issues around funding retirement versus the costs of access for a potential successor are huge. The tension between the family and the business in some cases is the main obstacle. Issues around, is the farm viable? How much flexibility is there to make the future operation more viable? How much change is possible and amenable to the parties that are engaged in the succession? I did mention a dearth of professionals and creative approaches. The question about whether it's intra-family or an unrelated transfer is really key. Fewer next generation people on the farm are looking to stay on the farm, which means that more farmers who are exiting need to look for non-related, non-family successors. So this whole question of identifying, recruiting, and training and onboarding a successor is a huge complexity in this arena. In the successor pipeline, I'm particularly concerned about successors to mid-size operations because I think the pipeline is a little bit broken and that they are less prepared to take on mid-size operations than those who are looking for smaller scale farm businesses. Next slide. So one key takeaway, I'm not going to go into this slide, is only to show you that I believe that life cycle transition planning is really critical for us to promote as service providers and advocates, which means that in any stage of a business, a transition is possible or necessary, whether it's they decide to stop farming, they get a disability. So at every stage, we want to encourage people to start to think about and take next steps around transition planning throughout the business life cycle. Next slide. This is, again, a chart from one of our guidebooks showing that farm seekers and farm owners, in fact, sort of have a parallel trajectory. The columns are new and beginning farmers on the farm seeker side and established farmers. On the other side, they're transitioning farmers and non-farming landowners. And you can see in each case, there's a stage where they have to prepare, then they have to find each other, and then finally, of course, they have to transact. So again, a visual sort of representation of how these pieces fit together. Next slide. So many of you are perhaps assistance providers. And I think the important takeaway here is the team approach. We have a guide to the team approach to farm succession planning, but I believe it applies to working with landowners, non-farming landowners, and farm seekers as well. It's important for each of us to understand what role we play, what our boundaries are, what our lane is, and how to do effective referrals, and how to build a network of providers so that we are not doing this in an isolated environment. In the blue box on the right, I think that at minimum, many of us can be trained to be generalists, which to me is this 5-step diagram, which says to create the environment for a conversation about farm succession or land access, to assess that particular customer's stage and situation, to be able to provide basic information, to effectively refer to resources and providers, and to help that customer establish next steps. In addition, we need specialists, which means that if you are a tax specialist, if you're an attorney, if you're a conservation professional, your specialty is likely to be brought in into a particular situation. And then there's sort of the coaching role where in some cases navigators play that role. At Land for Good, our field agents do that, which is to really go the distance as a case manager. And that may mean dealing with a lot of the HR concerns on the farm. Transfer of management is a particular thorny issue, negotiating a lease agreement, and so on. My favorite word, as some of you have heard me speak before, is ultra-crepidarianism, which means the habit of giving opinions and advice on matters outside of one's knowledge. And because we are dealing with people's lives and futures, we absolutely have to make sure that we do not practice ultra-crepidarianism. So the team approach is absolutely essential for providing the best and effective and safe information to our customers. Next slide. All right, in this last section, I was asked to talk a little bit about so-called non-traditional approaches. Not sure that that's the best term, but we're going to sort of slide through these. How are we doing for time? Can anybody give me a heads up on that? Doing okay? We all still have enough time for Q&A, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah,
All right.
we're going to 12:30, so you're good.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about now, provided my voice holds out, are this little laundry list of land trusts and easements. Those go together. Ground leases, the role of farmland investors. This comes up more and more. Group access, what we mean by that. The role of nonprofit landowners. Lease to own, which I mentioned before. Dealing with unrelated successors, and the social justice elements. And why do we need non-traditional approaches? Because, as I mentioned in the beginning, the traditional approaches, and certainly the historic notion that a farm is transferred from the exiting farmer to the firstborn son, is no longer adequate. Plus, it's not really possible for most beginning farmers to buy their first farm because of the escalating value of farmland. It's also true that we need non-traditional approaches to look at the more diverse audiences in a more equitable way. So there are a lot of reasons that we have to think outside the conventional and traditional box. Okay, next slide. Many of you are familiar with land trusts, so I won't go into this, only to acknowledge the distinction between community land trusts and conservation land trusts. Community land trusts have their history in affordable housing, and that's where the notion of community ownership and governance has emerged in the agricultural sector. Community land trust typically owns property as a 501c3, and then and then turns around and enables the purchase of a property, of a house on that owned land through a ground lease. And I'll talk about what a ground lease is in a second. So there's this sense of community ownership and governance, because the community land trust as a nonprofit has governance by members of the community, including the users of the property, community representatives, and other stakeholders. So how the land is used, all those relationships are decided by, quote, the community. Furthermore, there's a sense of the commons, that from the outside, the property still is private property, but it's commons on the inside in the sense of that community orientation. Furthermore, in the community land trust model, the land is permanently removed from the market, and so removed from speculative gain. And there are limits placed on the resale. So it makes it, takes it off the market and makes it typically more affordable. The community land trust model and the conservation land trust model, where there are various conservation missions, which you all know about, and conservation land trusts, also nonprofits, may purchase agricultural property and run the farm. There are examples of that with hired employees. They may rent the land that they've purchased. They also might do something like buy, protect, sell, where they remove the development rights and then turn around and sell it. So conservation land trusts may purchase or receive donated easements. And they also may do something like a community land trust, in which if they could keep the property and then provide a ground lease, it's sort of a hybrid between a conservation of a hybrid of a land trust, of a conservation and community land trust together. Okay, next slide. Easements, probably most of you know about. Conservation easements are very broad in their protection of conservation values, and their what qualifies, who is a qualifying receiver of the easement, the IRS charitable donation, and so on. An agricultural easement or agricultural conservation easement is a little bit different in that it is focused on agriculture and allows and may in fact encourage agriculture, and also further may restrict transfers in terms of the affordability of the transfer, and also who is eligible to acquire the land when it is transferred. There's also historic easements, which may have agricultural relevance. And then there are cultural or cultural respect easements, which is a new arena. And there's a lot of learning and investigation going on around preserving and protecting cultural values on a property and how they need to fit with the statutory values of typically the conservation or agricultural easement. This is a very exciting arena for growth and new advocacy. Next slide, please. Okay, ground lease, simply the tenant rents the land and owns the infrastructure. Often that's a residence or farm buildings. Not typical in the private sector. It makes the acquisition more affordable for the farmer because the farmer's not buying the land. It does offer security because typically the lease is actually very long-term, up to 99 years. Another attraction for this is that the farmer tenant builds equity in the infrastructure, which they redeem when they sell to the next tenant, or in some cases back to the landowner. The go-to source on this model is Equity Trust, an organization also based in Massachusetts. Next slide. Some of the challenges around easements and ground leases. Appraisals can be tricky. In some cases, there is a prohibition against subdivision, not only subdividing the parcel, the protected parcel, into more than one sub-parcel, but also dividing the interest so that a ground lease, because it separates the interest in ownership of the infrastructure, may also be prohibited. I'm involved in a couple of very gnarly transfer situations where those are the challenges. Transfers in general may be more challenging. Affordability in terms of communicating about what is affordable, does it actually make it more affordable with the easement on it, and so on. And then particularly complicating is easements with properties with easements and ground leases. So in case we don't think we have enough to work on, there's a laundry list right here. Next slide, please. Farmland investors. There's a lot of talk about farmland investors and in the global environment context of land grabbing. There are farmland investment entities that are looking to purchase and are doing so fairly aggressively for portfolio diversification for their investors. However, there are some that are values-based or mission-driven, and they are doing it for other reasons. They're typically more slow money returns on their investment, and they have social goals. For example, they want to be able to offer the land to sustainable or organic farmers. They want to be able to transition the land to organic. They want to offer to beginning or socially disadvantaged farmers, and so on. How these investment scenarios typically work is that there is an entity. The company manages pooled capital. Typically, they're only qualified investors. The company buys the property, and then they lease or lease to own to the farmer. Next slide. There are advantages. Some farmers are happily ensconced on land that is held by by investment entities. It can be a bridge to an eventual sale. It does, in many cases, save the property from a non-sale from a non-farm transaction. Sometimes it's the farmer that brings the property to the investment entity because they are maybe leasing that land or can no longer afford it, but they want to keep it from being sold for non-farm uses. It can be an incubator situation prior to ownership. Also, some of these good hat environment landlord entities provide technical support and other kinds of support. Examples are Iroquois Valley Farms and Dirt Capital. Land for Good has done 2 reports, one research report and a cases based on interviews with socially responsible investors and also with farmers who went through the prospectus of these socially responsible investors with a fine-tooth comb, came up with a lot of questions. We had a dialogue between the farmers and the investment entities and published 2 reports that talk about how these situations work and encourage farmers to do the math, compared to other situations that they might be able to avail themselves of. Is this a good situation for them? Next slide. Increasingly, we and many of you others have heard from farmers who say they want to farm as a group. They may talk about it as collaborative farming, cooperative farming, collective farming, and so on. Very popular notion. It seems attractive to many kinds of groups. In fact, there's a rich history in the cooperative movement in agriculture, including from very early African-American land cooperatives. So when we talk about group farming, farmers can share equipment, inputs, they can share marketing and or labor, and they can share land. So in this context, and Land for Good has a guide, a publication on group farmland access. We're talking about shared land. And that group can own or rent land together. It's not a novel concept, but there is great new interest. Next slide. So what are the defining characteristics of this group approach? And for us, because we have to put a boundary around what it is that we're talking about, and when we're talking to farmers who say, yeah, we want to farm as a group, what we mean. So it means 2 or more farmers farming a specific property. So there are legal arrangements regarding the rights and responsibilities. There are interpersonal arrangements around the social dynamics, the values, the spirit of cooperation, and then there are management variables, how that group is actually managed and governed. It's sort of the glue between the legal and the interpersonal. Next slide. So we have this typology of 4 group types, not to get into the weeds too much, but just to touch on this. One scenario is where there are, let's say, 3 or 4 farmers who are farming together as one business. It's a single enterprise, a single LLC, or however they're formed, one set of books, one website, one business, right? So they might own or rent a property as one group. They also might have separate businesses, but they are intentional in wanting to get onto a piece of land together. Separate businesses. Then there's what we call the situational group, where you might be a farmer saying, well, I think it'd be really interesting for me to be able to farm in the context of other farmers. And a typical example of that would be on an incubator. So you go to this piece of land or to a community farm, and you're farming next to farmers, but it wasn't intentional for you to be on this particular land with those particular other farmers. Nonetheless, you are connected by an overarching mission or framework or organization. And then just sort of the basket for other situations is a mixed group, where it might be farmers and non-farmers, like an intentional community, where some people are farmers and they're renting the land on this property, and other people are living there but not farming. Or it might be that some farmers own land and they're also renting land to other farmers. Next slide. This is from our guide. It's sort of a graphic. Again, won't get into the details, but you can see that you go through sort of a choice situation of what kind of group you are, whether you want to own or rent, and you follow the arrows to see that there are, in fact, essentially 10 different methods of implementing this group access, land access vision. Next slide. Lots of considerations. There may be only 10 methods, but there are lots of things to think about. Getting into the nitty-gritty. What names are on what documents? How do you calculate the initial and long-term affordability? Sometimes farmers say, oh, if we farm as a group, it's going to be more affordable. Not necessarily the case. Certainly the issues of security, may or may not be greater. Are you able to build wealth in the land if you are co-holding the land? What about independence and control if you are farming as a group? What about the infrastructure? Who gets to use what? How do you decide about building infrastructure? How do the businesses interact if there are more than one business on a property? And that's regardless of whether you are situational on an incubator or a community farm, or whether you are owning the land together but separate businesses. How is liability handled? What about farm labor and housing? Most important, how are entry and exit handled? If you want to leave this group, how do you do that? How do you redeem your equity? How do you get to decide? How do the rest of the people decide who gets to come in, and so on? How about USDA program participation if you are a group? And then just thinking through, what are the risks and pitfalls of the particular group model that your customers may be thinking about? Next slide. Of course, there are pros and cons. It may, in fact, be more affordable. Certainly, there's a communal community spirit with compatible values and the ability to share other kinds of group experiences, labor and sharing expertise, and so on. Spreading the risk. You may, in fact, be sharing and building equity together. It also requires considerable responsibility. I was working with a group of farmers who had their own individual businesses on rented land in a New England state. And they wanted to form a co-op so that they could be one entity. It would be easier for the landlord and so on. And we met and we met and we met and we met. And it turned out that there was no one in this well-meaning group of farmers who was willing to take on the co-op management function, the role of managing, who was going to deal with the books and so on. And so, in fact, it fell apart. So the spirit may be willing, but the reality is something else. So it needs a lot of trust, patience, and process skills. Next slide. All right, just an example, if we're talking about non-traditional, there are non-traditional landowners that we should be thinking about and we have experience with in our various endeavors in the New England, and certainly there are examples of across the country. A traditional conservation organization that is interested in preserving properties or owning properties for their conservation values may get into owning agricultural properties. They may be a community or an educational farm that owns or rents land and then turns around and rents. The example, Grow Food Northampton, has a long-term ground lease with one CSA operation and offers short-term small parcel leases to other farmers on their property. Incubator and training farms are an example of land tenure where farmers can lease. They're typically shorter term, depends on if it's a graduating incubator or not. Social service or other charitable entities. We worked with the Sisters of Mercy in a New England state. They had over 400 acres of land that they wanted to do a better job of stewarding through better leases with their tenants. And then there are community gardens and urban settings where farmers may be farming commercially and need better security. And they also may be interested in scaling up. So moving from an urban community farm setting to a peri-urban or more rural scaled up operation is not only a shift in land access, but also maybe a shift in production methods, equipment, the marketing and all of that. So that is a big shift in not only the land holding entity, but in all the other aspects that go along with scaling up. Next slide. So lease to own, I mentioned as not a legal term. The right of first refusal is where if the landowner is intending to sell, they get an offer from the market and the tenant has the right to match that offer. In the right of first offer, the landowner tells the tenant that they are planning to put the land on the market and the tenant has the right to make an offer before the property goes on the market. It's a right, but not an obligation. A purchase option is a little bit more of a formal commitment to say at a certain point in the future, for this price or a price to be determined at a future date, this purchase transaction will occur. These rights and options can be embedded in a lease or they can be a separate arrangement. In a land contract, the owner finances the, wait a minute, do I have that right? Let's skip that because I don't think what I have right there is right. So let's just move on. Okay, finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the social justice actions that landowners can take. We have a new publication on the social landowner guide to social justice actions, was just released, based on our growing understanding and appreciation of land theft and dispossession in a land access framework, and the recognition that white landowners have and can play a role in these issues. Land transactions can, in fact, advance social justice objectives and move from emotions in terms of the legacy of the land and the values about land and ownership to actions. In any of these transactions, we need to understand and be educated about the language you use, the costs involved, what terms we use, and how we're targeting these kinds of activities. Next slide. In this landowner guide, we also have a fork in the road. There are two ways to do these actions. One, while retaining ownership. And again, this is based on the assumption that we're not challenging the current private property landowner culture in our country. So one way to do some of these methods is by, while retaining ownership, the other is in transferring ownership. So in retaining ownership, this is the list of things that we unpack. Acknowledgement being the most simple and basic in terms of any kind of transaction. Invitation is a little bit more formal, but still quite casual in the sense of inviting uses on land held by a landowner. A cultural use agreement is essentially, you remember that chart earlier on about the division of the bundle of sticks. A cultural use agreement is essentially a license or a permit, can be oral or written. A lease then is a little bit more, is a formal division of those rights while retaining ownership, and then a cultural respect or conservation, cultural conservation easement, which I described a little bit earlier on. When we talk about transferring ownership, there are essentially 4 ways to do this, and it's not limited to this particular social motivation. It's either through sale, gift, donation, or bequest. And what we're talking about is the framework of returning stolen or unceded land to indigenous communities, or transferring to African American descendants in the context of stolen people on stolen land. Next slide, please. So lots of considerations for landowners in this arena. This way of looking at social justice actions can pertain to various groups and communities, including, beginning farmers, limited resource farmers, other marginalized groups, and so on. Regardless, the main message of our guide and in this presentation is that landowners and their service providers must engage with the communities they seek to support. The phrase "nothing about us without us" certainly pertains in these kinds of transactions. Landowners' goals, motivations, and priorities, and the feasibility of doing these transactions may vary. And also, these conversations are hard. They have to be based on genuine and trusting relationships, which have to be built over time. And these transactions can be challenging and complex. They can also be very rewarding. And our guide gives examples of white landowners who have done some pretty amazing things with some pretty amazing communities and some pretty astounding dialogue. Next slide, please. All right, we're wrapping up here. This is sort of a colorful list of some of Land for Good's resources. You'll see at the very bottom on the right, we have online toolboxes, as many of you do as well, that are targeted to seekers, landowners, and succession, and also targeted particularly to service providers. So there's a whole bunch of guides, there's fact sheets, and so on. So I think with that, let's go to the next slide. So I'm revisiting here with you. Why are we here? Remember, at the very beginning, we talked about the allocation of interests. We've talked about land stewardship, equity and justice, new tenure models, and the role of rights and property in all of these kinds of transactions in their social, political, historic, legal, financial, spiritual, cultural, and global contexts. I have to say that there has been a lot of progress in this arena since we first started 20 years ago at Land for Good. No one was talking about land access. In 2018, we had a national farmland clinic. We had over 40 programs expressing interest, and we're hoping to have another clinic in the near future, in the next couple of years, and I'm sure there will be more programs. We've had 2 national Changing Lands, Changing Hands conferences. In 2017, USDA was a partner in that, just demonstrating how, how the acknowledgement of these issues has risen. Land access now shows up in much food system work, in food plans that are at the local and state level, in community food groups, and so on, including urban land access, which we don't specialize in, but certainly there is a sort of a parallel track to that. And we do, by the way, have a guide on urban land access, and all the ways in which research, policies and land access programs, including in beginning farmer and rancher development program, have sprung up. So that is all good news. Next slide. We have new understandings. In our 2018 Conference of Changing Lands, Changing Hands, there were over 100 policy and program and practice ideas, which you will find on our website. We are currently involved with other partners in some research, which I told you about. I mentioned briefly about scale and also location and type of farm being applicable lenses to how we think about land access, tenure, and transfer. And we are working much harder than we ever have at overcoming structural and attitudinal barriers for marginalized communities, and also addressing the impacts of climate change and our recent evolving political landscape. Who knows what that might look like in the future. But there are new programs, networks, and policies, and we have to continue to build and share skills and knowledge. We have to have our advocacy and awareness built in respectful dialogue. And we have to continue to refine our service delivery. Remember ultra-crepidarianism, and working on our roles and lanes and networks to evolve our service capacity. Next slide. So where are we going? Farmland's report, now this is quite dated, but it still pertains, is a statement that for a resilient agriculture, both land ownership and tenancy under the appropriate conditions should be accepted and promoted. And in general, policies and programs should foster increased opportunity, affordable options, equitable and secure tenure for all, timely transfer and meaningful legacy, land stewardship, and adequate professional and public support for farm access and transfer. Next slide. That is it. And so now we have about 15 minutes for questions and conversation. I'm not sure what you want to do with the deck, or Bonnie, I'll pass it to you to handle the Q&A for as much as I am able.
Sure. And Kara, do we want to, yeah, there we go. We'll just go to a regular screen here. I have a few questions that people sent me in the chat. The first one is from Tessa. She says, I am working on a scan of state and federal programs and resources that support equitable agricultural land access. If I heard correctly, Kathy, you mentioned that at the beginning, there is no overarching federal land access policy. Can you say more about what does exist, and does Land for Good have more information available about your assessment of gaps in public support?
Well, that's a huge question, which you know, the statement I made was that there's no overarching policy on land tenure. So land access, how land is acquired, held, and passed on. That is still true in terms of an overarching policy statement. So the question is do I have a handle on what policies there are? I mean, there's state level policy, there's federal policy, there's policy and programs around land access, there's policy and programs around farm succession, everything from modifications to the capital gains to incentivizing landowners to lease to beginning farmers. There's a list, which I can't really go into now. If I would be happy to follow up. Certainly other people have done scans of the policy and program challenges nationally. And so we can explore that a little one-on-one. And if there's a way to share that, Jan, with participants here, we can do that. But that's a slope I don't want to go down right now. But it's a great question, and I'm glad you're researching it.
Great. Carl is asking, to what extent do you think the corn soy CAFO complex is unsustainable and could become a large pool of farmland available in the future?
Holy cow. So, you know, my handle, I think about that because I think that's a lot of where, I mean, it's clearly where a lot of land is. And unless we change our reliance on animal agriculture and need to diminish our need for animal feed, that commodity universe is not likely to change substantially. Whether we can make those commodity farms available to the next generation in ways that will preserve them at the family scale rather than consolidating them, I think is a relevant question for this conversation. And part of what I mentioned in terms of my concern about the pipeline for farmers who have the capability, financial and skill-wise, to take on those mid-sized farms is, I think, an important consideration. My experience with the Beginning Farm and Rancher Development Program, I was a panel manager for 2 rounds, so I've read hundreds of beginning farmer applications, and very few of them are geared toward training mid-sized beginning farmers. So they either need to focus on training mid-sized beginning farmers as successors, better prepare intra-family succession so that those people who do want to stay in the family on a mid-sized farm are able to do so, or work better to scale up small-scale farmers and prepare them to take on mid-sized farms, many of whom are not interested in doing that. They want to take their own little farm and make it a bigger farm, but not be the same farm. So I think that that's it's a huge question, and I'm trying to sort of dial it in to the relevance for land access and transfer. Again, happy to talk with that person. Anybody can email me, and happy to carry that conversation forward. Next question.
Yes, the next question is from Jill, who is a goat farmer. She mentioned finding it more challenging to locate farmland for rent than farmland for sale. So for smaller scale farmers, can you suggest any tools or advice for locating that viable farmland for rent, or creative ways to find that land and access it?
So looking for land for rent as a particular strategy, we have a couple of worksheets that develop a search plan. I would say, developing a search plan, if you're in a state that has a land access program, or you can find a service provider that will help you think strategically about that. And it may be as simple as a list of, make a flyer, for example. And it seems pretty basic, but next time you go to a workshop or a conference, post that you're looking to lease land. Go to farmers in your area that you think might have a few acres to spare. Be really clear about, are you looking for raw land? Do you need a barn? Do you need to be living there? We have a worksheet that we call necessary, desirable, optional. What's absolutely necessary for you to rent in terms of acreage, infrastructure, and so on. And then what are the target places where you think you might find landowners at that scale, both farming and non-farming? So is there a farm that might be able to peel off some? Is there a community where if you need 5 acres, there may be some estate landholders? What about public land? What about municipal land? What about, various educational, start to think outside the box with that laundry list that I provided.
Okay, next question is from Sophie. Sophie says, I'm a first-year PhD student in cultural anthropology and am exploring potential topics for my dissertation. Are there particular topics or questions that you think could benefit from more ethnographic or mixed methods of social science research?
Sure. Email me and we can talk about it.
Great.
Okay.
I only have one more in the chat from Bob. Is there anyone looking at Islamic finance models, such as, I'm going to try to say this, Musharaka Aka Halal mortgage?
So I think what you mean is because they, in Islamic culture, you can't pay interest. So there are some examples of where people are looking at that, and certainly you won't be able to find that with conventional lenders, but you might be able to find it with non-conventional lenders. I would be happy to explore that with the questioner as well. I think there may be some community land trusts or socially responsible investors that would be interested in exploring that angle. Thank you for that question.
I have another question from Melissa. Have you seen instances where zoning was changed to make it easier to cluster housing? In my area of Minnesota, the rule is 1 house per 40 acres.
Well, certainly cluster zoning is a thing. And I haven't been involved in the land use planning universe for a while, but I do know that cluster zoning, like I say, is a thing. So whether it's possible to pass cluster zoning in your neck of the woods, there are, classic examples of best practice for cluster zoning. And I would say, go to the resources for that. I don't know exactly what the American Planning Association, perhaps. New England, I know there may be more examples in New England than there are in other regions. I don't know, but I think cluster zoning is a really good idea, provided that the open space that is a result of that is made that the permitted uses include agriculture. I think there are also, this is sort of at the edge of the napkin, but intentional communities or what are they called? Agri-burbs. The subdivisions that focus on or include subdivisions. There's agritopia. I'm thinking of, and I haven't looked at this. I beg your pardon?
Agrihoods, I think.
Okay, whatever the term is, because that's sort of a different way of cutting the same question. It's like, how do we shape land use regulation to accommodate and foster agriculture within a development framework? So I think that's a really good thing to explore.
Great. I have another question from Bob, who is trying to challenge my ability to pronounce things. Have you investigated the models of FIV or FEV in France or Landvan in the Netherlands? Are there lessons from what they are doing? Are you familiar with?
No, not familiar. Nope. But again, happy to have you email. I'll take a look at what they are and we can chat.
Great. And Jan did put Kathy's email in the chat for those that want to reach out to her directly. Any other questions? I think that's probably wrapping us up. And I know that Jan wanted to share a survey. We might want to share that again here at the end.
I just stuck it in, and then it's supposed to come up when the meeting ends too. So if you could just take it at one of those links, that would be great.
Yes, Gary, the chat will be saved. We're recording and it will be saved with the recording. We will have, so everyone who registered for this webinar will receive the recording. And we did have a question come up about slides and whether or not the slides can be shared with everyone who attended today. I guess that's a question for you, Kathy.
If you make it into a PDF.
You get into a PDF. Okay, well, we can send both of those out then when we share, and then probably we'll make the link available on the Farmland Access Hub website somewhere.
And I'll just interject, we've just finished all the rest of the Farmland Access Hub footage, so we can add this and we'll have a full playlist on the Renewing the Countryside YouTube.
Great.
Thank you very much for attending, and best of luck to you in your work. And I think we'll continue to make progress. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Kathy.